Thank you, Emily. So as Emily said, my name is Taya and I am a part of Cardiff staff. So I am also, I was thinking of how to describe myself that would go with the conference today. And I guess Priti Patel and Boris Johnson would call me a do-gooder. And also I am studying to be one of those lefty lawyers. So quite proud of myself for that. So I'm really excited about this panel because it is talking about the roller coaster of a year that we've had and how it has impacted a lot of us, and within society, different groups have been impacted more than others. So we're looking at how what that has been like for people within the refugee sector, whether it's individuals seeking sanctuary and those who are working with them. So I'm very, very excited to be having conversation with our incredible panelists today. So starting with Professor Alexander Betts, who is Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs at Oxford University, and with Sabir Zazai, who is also the CEO of Scottish Refugee Council, and Lorna Gledhill, who is Deputy Director of Asylum Matters. It's great to have you all here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation we're about to have. So I'm going to start with asking our panelists to introduce themselves and also to just say a little bit about what the biggest challenge of 2020 has been for the refugee sector from their perspective. So starting with Lorna, hi, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and go into that?
Hiya, thanks, Taya. This is a very strange experience. I used to come to STAR conferences a lot and do workshops for you guys. So doing it remotely from Glasgow feels strange, but thank you so much for having me again. So yeah, I'm Lorna, I'm the Deputy Director at Asylum Matters, and Asylum Matters is an advocacy project that works locally and nationally to improve the lives of people seeking sanctuary, and we do that through working with local organisations, activists, community groups, refugee community groups themselves, to change the narrative a bit like what you guys do here at STAR and try and promote some positive social and political change. Some of you may have met my colleagues. We work in the West Midlands and Yorkshire and Humber, in the Northeast, the Northwest, and in Wales. If you haven't, get in touch with Emily and we can put you all in touch, because they're active and keen to be in touch with groups working for refugee rights locally. So 2020 has been a year, really, hasn't it? It's been a very, very interesting year, and it's been a tough year for all of us. And the pandemic has dramatically changed the way that we live our lives, the way that we work, the way that we communicate, and kind of what seems important, really. But for people seeking asylum and those working alongside them, COVID has exacerbated pre-existing difficulties and introduced new ones. So for people working alongside those seeking sanctuary, those services have to dramatically change the way that they deliver their services, deliver critical support remotely, but also have to defend and fight for people seeking asylum to have access to basic needs: housing, shelter, financial support, healthcare. And people seeking asylum themselves, like so many of us across the country, have been battling with social isolation, loneliness, poverty, housing insecurity. But fundamentally, COVID didn't create these problems for people seeking asylum. Yeah, they made it worse for sure, but it didn't create it. So as many of you will know, people seeking asylum don't have the right to work and receive barely £5 a day in financial support. People are provided with housing on a no-choice basis across the country. And during the pandemic, I'm sure you will have seen news articles, that's included hotels and even kind of army barracks in parts of Kent and Wales. Living off £5 a day during a pandemic is going to be difficult. Not being able to buy enough food for your family is going to be difficult. Not being able to have access to Wi-Fi in your accommodation to homeschool your children is going to be incredibly difficult. Living in crowded accommodation, old MOD sites with people you don't know is going to be difficult. Waiting for months and years for the state to decide whether or not you can stay in the country is going to be incredibly difficult. To say that living life in limbo, in poverty, and navigating the asylum system during a pandemic is a challenge would be a pretty drastic understatement. However, those seeking sanctuary have had another challenge, and both Emily and Taya, you've mentioned this already, and that's been the kind of increasing politicization of asylum. And in these presentations that I used to do at STAR conferences, I used to do a PowerPoint presentation on hostile media coverage, and I'd be picking up stories from 2000, 2002. I no longer have to look so far back to find bad media coverage of asylum issues. That's all happened within this year. We've even seen this year far-right activity, particularly harassing folk arriving in Dover and people living in asylum accommodation across the country. And we often talk about this vicious cycle where media coverage, a very specific understanding of a certain type of public opinion, and political decision-making gets caught up in this sort of whirlpool of misinformation. It feels like hysteria, and it makes kind of humane, compassionate, and reasoned decision-making on policy feel impossible. And right now it feels like we're in that middle of that whirlpool. And then with that, you kind of have to think about what's get lost in this little whirlpool. And that's like the people themselves, right? So people's lives, futures, hopes, and dreams are in this middle of this mess. And when people focus on numbers, when we talk about this abstract idea of channel crossings, when we talk about firm and fair responses to a crisis, we lose sight of people, right? So in terms of what our like biggest challenge of 2020 in this like absolute mountain of challenges, I guess, it is changing that narrative, finding a way out of that whirlpool and disrupting this kind of cycle of misinformation that creates poor policy making. And I guess it's down to all of us, right, to tell the stories that we want to tell about welcome and solidarity. But that's difficult. And so, yeah, for me, that's been the biggest challenge for the sector in 2020.
Thank you so much, Lorna. As you said, it is basically a mountain of challenges that have been faced by a lot of people, by a lot of individuals taking sanctuary this year. But definitely changing the narrative is something that we're hopefully going to learn about during this conference, and just be encouraging. So if I could ask Professor Alexander Betts to just introduce yourself, as well as to go into a little bit about what you think the biggest challenge has been as well. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'm Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs at Oxford University, and I'm based in a centre called the Refugee Studies Centre, and we do research, teaching and outreach relating to all aspects of forced displacement. Now, a big part of our work is quite global in orientation, and much of my research is Africa focused, a little bit in the Middle East and Latin America. So I think part of what I'd hope to contribute to this is situating the UK context in something a little bit more global, and seeing where we are in relation to the wider world and some of the underlying causes of why people are forced to come to the UK and move elsewhere. The other thing I should say about myself is I think 20 years ago, I was volunteer coordinator of STAR Bristol University. And so STAR played a role in kind of the development of the ideas that led me to do the stuff I've done since. So it's brilliant that it's still going, and congratulations to Emily and the whole team on everything you're doing. It's a privilege to be involved. The biggest challenge of 2020, I think Lorna did a fantastic job of highlighting that the inevitable response is COVID-19. But then the question is, what aspect of COVID-19 and how, particularly given that COVID-19, at least in a UK context, isn't the only challenge we've faced this year. Brexit, the politics that was pre-existing COVID-19, the things that COVID-19 has amplified that were already really difficult for asylum and refugee rights have in a way been magnified. I think what I'd like to do is situate that in the bigger context and say, well, actually, COVID-19 has had effects through the health implications, the lockdown implications, and arguably the biggest effect here and globally will be through the global recession it creates, through the economic implications, which will be enormous and have ripple effects. And what we know on a global scale from data by the World Bank and others is that COVID-19 has the greatest health effects amongst older populations and richer populations. But actually for relatively economically poorer populations and younger populations, it's the economic effects that are going to be most dire. And that's both indirect and direct. What we know is that global recession that will result from COVID-19 is going to dramatically affect the causes of displacement, the consequences for displaced people, and the responses to displacement. So we know from looking, for instance, at the 2008-2009 financial crisis, that when there is a shrinking in the economy, it has major effects on fragile states, authoritarianism, and conflict around the world. So in Africa, for instance, a relatively small cut in GDP can lead to an uptick in conflict. And so we're going to see rising numbers of displaced people as a result of those economic effects. And we already have more displaced people around the world than at any time since the Second World War. Some 75 million people, about 1% of the world's population are displaced, about a third of whom are refugees forced across international borders. That is going to grow. But also, on a global scale, it's going to get more difficult for displaced populations, because we know from existing research on the effects of recessions that there are major effects on multilateral aid. We've seen this week the Overseas Development Aid budget of the UK cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%, despite supposedly being ring-fenced by the government. We've seen predictions of cuts in remittances, which many refugees depend upon, money transfers by their families, by their networks. And we also see in all of the research a disproportionate effect on economic sectors in which refugees and forcibly displaced people often work. So the informal economy is going to be dramatically affected around the world. Certain sectors, service sectors, hospitality, catering, construction, disproportionately affected. And we know that displaced people, including refugees, are more likely to lose their jobs than the average member of the population. But also in terms of responses, recession has major effects for people's commitment to human rights. We know from data on recessions in the past that people's commitment to refugee rights and asylum declines. So we face a big challenge, not just here, but globally, in terms of rising needs. There are going to be more people displaced, but also diminishing political will. Now, that trend is not inevitable. That trend depends on political choices. And political choices depend on the public's engagement with their own governments. So there is an answer which says, the social science probably says the worst is yet to come. But then the activist in all of us should perhaps say, there is nothing inevitable about that. Politics will shape the way we define our societies and make them societies of welcome. So that's a task for all of us.
That is definitely a lot to think about, and hopefully to unpack throughout the rest of this conversation about how we can all just get in touch with our politicians and get talking more about what we can do to help everybody. Going to our final panelist today, Sabir, would you like to introduce yourself and just go a little bit into the biggest challenge?
Thanks, Taya. Yeah, I'm delighted to be connected here and really good to see some familiar and new faces. First of all, I'm Sabir Zazai. I'm Chief Executive of Scottish Refugee Council. Scottish Refugee Council is a leading refugee agency in Scotland, and we work with refugees and asylum seekers as they find their way through the complexities of the asylum system, but also through the journey of integration. Really grateful to Lorna and Alex for their input, really helpful. Before I get into my input, I think I'll also give my own anecdote of coming across the STAR group, the Student Action for Refugees. When I was going through the asylum system myself, fleeing the conflict in Afghanistan, I was living in Coventry, and there was an event organized at that time by university students. I don't know if there is a STAR Coventry group, but they invited us all to an event at the university, and my education was disrupted at year 7 in Afghanistan, and then for the first time stepping into an educational institution and being welcomed and being told that you're welcome here, and if there's anything we can do and so on. That then enabled me and inspired me to start studying at Coventry University. So what you do is an important aspect of integration and standing for people's rights, but also bringing that movement together of students of diverse backgrounds, I think is really, really important now than ever before. In terms of the challenges, I'm not going to go through each point. Lorna very eloquently raised, and Alex gave a global context, which are all very, very relevant. What I do see is that there were pre-existing issues with the asylum system, but in fact, COVID-19 broke the back of the system. And when we talk about a broken system, we had a broken system well before COVID-19, and COVID-19 just added further to the issues that were there. What I will do is, in terms of my contribution, I think I'll cover the challenges in 3 key headings that are very clear and evident in the system. One is poverty. Poverty is embedded in the asylum system, and sadly, poverty in terms of destitution are being used as a policy lever to deter people from seeking asylum. Food, again, the same issue. People have been put into conditions where access to food has been a challenge, particularly now with COVID-19, and also the issue of accommodation, where people are put well before COVID-19 as well. So when I was dispersed to Coventry, I didn't end up in any posh area. We ended up in areas with existing economic and social challenges. So again, if I give an example of Glasgow, it wasn't just areas with social and economic challenges, but hundreds of people right at the beginning, in the midst of COVID-19, were moved to hotels in the center of Glasgow. And yeah, I love Glasgow, and this is a great city, but ending up in the city center in hotels, in empty city center, is not pleasant to anyone, and not knowing what's happening to you. The second point that is associated with our asylum system, sadly, is injustices. So firstly, we have 36,000 people waiting for 6 months for a decision, and that in itself it's not that those decisions cannot be made. I think in the face of this pandemic, it would have been wise to give people some kind of a temporary limited leave to remain, so they could look after themselves, and they could also save the rest of us as well from this deadly pandemic. So people are waiting much longer now for a decision. People are denied safe and legal routes. We talk about people arriving in boats, we talk about people making dangerous journeys, but we also understand at the same time that there is no asylum visa to the UK. If I'd at the time I was fleeing the Taliban regime, I couldn't go anywhere to ask for protection in the UK. And that protection is now externalized further and further. The borders are externalized further and further. The third point I want to wrap up with is structural racism, and that is fully embedded in the system. We understand from research that BME communities are at acute risk of COVID-19, but asylum seekers and refugees are part of that group. But we ask them to, although the Home Office introduced some positive changes at the beginning of COVID-19, which we all advocated for, they are at risk of homelessness at the moment, they're at risk of evictions, and they're asked to travel to interviews again. Also, no recourse to public fund, and the fact that in light of COVID-19, universal credit was upgraded by £20. Asylum seekers ended up with 26 pence and then another 3 pence. So what asylum seekers get, a standard rate, is 40% below what people get under universal credit. That doesn't mean that people seeking protection are eating less or spending less, or they don't survive, they can survive on less. But that is literally treating people differently. They're human beings, people with hopes and aspirations, and no different from people who will get universal credit. But we have a system that puts them at financial disadvantage intentionally. The other point that Lorna clearly raised is obviously the right to work for asylum seekers to have access to dignified income. But the final point on that structural racism is the fact that we have people in the care of an institution who only last week by EHRC, Equalities and Human Rights Commission, were identified that they were breaching the public sector equalities duty under Windrush. And that is a clear example of Windrush might be a different scenario, but if we look deep into the institution, how it treats people who simply come here to rebuild their lives, to make a contribution, and to be part of our society, there will be many other examples where certain duties that we have to offer to all our citizens have been denied to those who seek protection here. So it's a challenging year for all of us, the least. I think we can feel it right here. And Alex, Lorna, and I would have been sitting at a table somewhere in a hall, but we've all turned into small boxes on a screen in somewhere. And I think that is what it shows, that COVID-19 is affecting us all, and it's affecting people seeking protection in the same way as well. And if they're safe, we're safe. And even beyond COVID-19, if they prosper, we prosper too. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Sabir. You mentioned about poverty as well as just asylum support rates. And Lorna was just going to ask, Asylum Matters released a report recently about this. Could you just go a little bit into that and what you guys found out?
Yeah, definitely. So, we've done quite a lot of work around asylum support rates for a while, but as you said, we produced a report in October, sorry with my dates, called Locked into Poverty, and it was it came out of a survey we did with just under 200 people seeking asylum about what life was actually like living on £5 a day, both in general but also during the pandemic. We all know, right? Anyone that works with people seeking asylum, anyone who looks at just the basic maths of trying to live on £5 a day, we know that that's not enough. You know, that's not enough to meet your essential living needs. And that survey and the report that came out on the back of it showed that, right? So it was something like 84% of people that we spoke to couldn't buy enough food for themselves and their families. Only 1 in 10 could buy enough data on their phones to stay in touch with family abroad, family in the UK, or even essential services like lawyers or asylum advice organisations and things like that. I think it was something like 2% of people said that they could buy enough clothes for themselves and their families. So these are like basic living needs, the real like bottom line of what you need to survive. And as Sabir says, you know, these are people that are kind of within the duty of care of the Home Office, and the Home Office has a responsibility to keep them safe because they don't have the right to work and because they are entirely reliant on financial support from the Home Office. And what that report very, very clearly showed was that people weren't able to meet their essential living needs. They were living in poverty, they were living in, you know, state-sponsored destitution, and it's really important that the Home Office takes that seriously. Unfortunately, what we did see within the same period of time was a 3p increase in asylum support rates. So the tricky thing we've got here is what we all know is the reality of people's lives living on asylum support and what the Home Office is willing to accept as evidence and truth.
Thank you so much for that. I know just reading around, Scottish Refugee Council helped around 389 people this year who are living in destitution because of due to Home Office policy. And just thinking about the challenges that have been mentioned, so destitution, the problems with asylum support rates and not being able to work. Alex, are there any ideas that you would advise the government to adopt, any policy changes, and also talking about where the UK is in the context of other countries as well?
Yeah, I mean, taking into account everything that we've heard about UK asylum policy, its intersection with poverty, the implications of living on £5 a day, I suppose one of the questions is, how do you engage the government? How do you engage a Home Office in the way that it is structured, giving the narratives coming out of it? I think one message that we need is that everybody needs to have a degree of perspective, that the numbers of refugees in the UK are tiny relative even to global refugee numbers. Even on a global scale, refugees are 0.35% of the world's population, which should be manageable globally. But the kind of numbers of asylum seekers and refugees we get in the UK relative to 25 million around the world are minuscule. We're talking about 30,000 people in a given year. That should be manageable. Being able to allow those people to live in dignity should be something in the context of the enormous spending that's taking place just to sustain business and people in COVID-19. We can afford that. Now, the implicit rationale is that deterrence in the hostile environment dissuade people from coming to the UK, that somehow someone's more likely to stay in France or Italy than come to the UK. Now, there's almost no evidence that suggests that those deterrence policies even work on their own terms. The idea that asylum seekers and refugees are going, okay, my friends and family are in the UK, I want to go to an English-speaking environment, I've got an idea of what it's like to live in the UK, I'm going to look up the policies and amounts of money I'll get from the government, compare and contrast. That's not happening. So even on its own terms, I think we have to kind of enable the government to recognise that this isn't an effective deterrent. And of course, even if it were an effective deterrent, it's clearly immoral, unethical, and exacerbates all kinds of negative social consequences. So if we were to enable the government to see that, the question would be, well, why do they still do it? Part of it is, I think, disingenuous. Part of it is that serious politicians and policymakers don't actually think the hostile environment diminishes the likelihood that people will come to the UK, but they want to represent themselves in the media in a particular way. They want to get the headlines of support from the Daily Mail, the right-wing tabloid press that is very anti-asylum. And so I think the challenge is to constantly highlight to the government where the evidence lies and what the moral argument is, but also understand that we've got to disrupt some of the structural barriers, which are about the portrayal of refugees and asylum seekers in the media and the sense that politicians feel that they need to pander to that. So it needs us to change the discourse, but also structurally look at the politics that has somehow made the unacceptable appear acceptable, or enabled people like the Home Secretary to argue that it's necessary. It's not necessary, it's not helpful, and it's immoral. And I think if we can argue that calmly, reasonably, and with evidence to the politicians, the policymakers, to the media, gradually we can shift it. But it's as soon as you start hearing the kind of evidence we've heard, it becomes incontrovertible. So it's just getting that message across.
Definitely. So on that, on the messages about how they're definitely trying to pander to people like the Daily Mail and encouraging that kind of negative rhetoric about individuals seeking asylum. Sabir, you were talking about structural racism, and what do you think has been the effect of the rhetoric that the government has been using on the people that you've been supporting in Scotland, and how is that kind of manifested?
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree, I think, on the importance of engaging with the government and finding the right angles to engage, what creates that interaction with government. And that is what we've been reflecting on all of us in the sector. And there has been some really good development in terms of communicating these pressures. Rhetoric is damaging, especially if it comes from senior levels at the government. And we've seen some really tragic and sad examples of that, from Joe Cox to the attacks on lawyers in London and so on. I think that is really, really important. And I'm pleased that the government is feeling that, especially the likes of the immigration minister and senior officials that we're engaging in with on regular basis. But I think if there was any advice to the government, the advice, they have the advice. We don't have to advise them. They need to learn from the Windrush report. It is there. And what we're trying in the sector, those of us, we're not against anyone here. We don't have any grudges with Home Office or the Home Secretary. We are the vanguard and an early warning system to avoid that sad embarrassment that this government faced. I'm proud of the UK's long-standing tradition of offering sanctuary and protection to people over generation. And I receive that welcome as well. I feel bad when that welcome is undermined and that tradition is undermined. I think the Windrush has got some clear recommendations, and I think that really relates to asylum as well. But the other point is around integration, because it's not just about the asylum system. Integration is very complex, and especially it becomes much more challenging now during the pandemic, because you don't have the bonds and bridges for people to establish roots now. People are we're in lockdown, you don't speak to your neighbors as much. So integration longer term, as Alex said, in terms of some of the global issues, integration will become an issue because people are not engaging. Everyday integration for us happens within bus stops, post offices, community centres and others. These are not taking place. I think the government needs to look at the bigger picture as well. We welcome 20,000 Syrian refugees. Their integration is important, and other people who've arrived through the asylum system as well. So I think if there was advice to the government from us, it will be a number of things that they need to take into account. And I think those are clearly reflected in the Windrush report as well. So what we're trying to put across in the sector to the Home Office and to the government is, especially as we're now in this context of COVID, but also Brexit as well, is that the government is talking about global Britain, cause for good. Well, yeah, you cannot be a cause for good when you start picking on your own citizens standing for the rights of those seeking protection here. So you cannot have cause for good when we call others do-gooders, simply because they are standing for the rights. So what we need is an effective access to the asylum process, first of all. If we want to really be a global Britain, all people seeking protection should have the opportunity to be able to do so. A fair, humane, and efficient asylum system. All people seeking asylum should have their claims assessed fairly, humanely, and effectively. And the fifth point is reception conditions that promote dignity, liberty, empowerment, and integration. And that support is provided during the asylum system. It should be fair and not anything below universal credit or anything that is being given to the wider citizens. But again, that point around integration and also in terms of the fact that Alex highlighted the global issues, is also we need global solidarity and responsibility sharing if we really want to be a global Britain and cause for good. And the UK should play a role in providing sustainable solutions to forced migration. I think we need to open our eyes to the fact that people are forced to flee conflicts, but people are also forced to flee poverty. We will all do that. I have children. If I struggle to feed them, I'll have to go somewhere else to find something to feed them. This is human nature. We'll all be making our ways to either get ourselves and our children to safety or get them to a place where we can look after them.
Definitely, I think that is one of the things that has been coming out about our immigration asylum system, that it seems to be very inhumane in some respects when it comes to just us welcoming people, and I guess politicians are supposed to represent the voice of the people, and we don't necessarily see that. Lorna, I was just going to ask, Sabir mentioned about sustainable solutions with the immigration asylum system. What do you have any ideas of how what this could look like based on your experience?
I think probably my solutions, and this isn't just me cheating, but would be very similar to what Alex and Sabir have put out. I think what, particularly in terms of kind of reception conditions, and that's kind of where Asylum Matters does the majority of its work, is about how people are treated when they're seeking asylum here in the UK. We've had solutions for a long time. The big question is how you win the argument, right? How do you convince those that are making policy, are designing the systems to make them humane, to make them kind of fair and something that we can all be proud of. And I think Sabir's sort of reference to, the UK's history of welcoming people seeking sanctuary, believe me, it's not perfect, but we have done it in the past. And it is something that we should reference and remind current government officials of. Is that how, this is something that we've done before and we can do, and people seeking sanctuary and people who are refugees have made themselves, made their homes here in the UK and are part of our society and should be treated as such. So I think in terms of things that would make a really, really significant difference to the lives of people seeking asylum, the right to work is a huge one. We know that it's a big thing for people who are going through the asylum system. The fact that they're not able to work to support themselves and their families is just ridiculous. There's a huge amount of support for that reform. It's one of the, I would say it's one of the only aspects of asylum reform where there is a certain amount of cross-party support. We also know that there was some polling done recently in some of the most contested parliamentary constituencies across the country. And within that polling, 77% of those that were polled felt that giving people seeking asylum the right to work would improve and encourage integration. So, support for people seeking sanctuary is not a party political thing. It's across the whole spectrum, and I think that's something that we do need to get better at talking about, particularly when it comes to persuading the current government, future governments, past governments of the importance of reform. It doesn't have to be a politicised thing. This is about human dignity. It's about the way that we treat people when they arrive in the country. Slightly garbled answer, but yes, right to work I think is one that would really make a significant difference to people who are going through the asylum system.
I think just one quick point on that. I think Lorna did some really excellent work here in Scotland when she was with the Scottish Refugee Council, and still not recovered from the fact that she's left us, was the refugee rights to vote. And I think, I don't know if Lorna, if you want to talk about that, that would be great. But some excellent achievement we had here with Scottish Parliament to allow refugees to vote. But I think when we were trying to push for asylum seekers' right to vote as well, that's when Lorna moved on. So I'll leave that to you.
That's not why I moved on, just to clarify. I was actually going to, thanks for reminding me, Sabir, I was going to mention that, because often when things feel so bleak, right, you forget and you lose the points where progress has been made, and when things are actually going in the right direction. And there have been elements of kind of positive news in 2020 as well. So earlier this year, both Scottish Parliament and the Senate in Wales passed legislation that would give refugees the right to vote in local and devolved government elections. That's a huge, huge thing, and something that I didn't think I would ever see in my lifetime, if I'm honest. But is this kind of democratic deficit is how we framed it in Scotland when I was doing the work there, which is basically that, there's lots of people living in the UK, refugees included, who this is their home. This is where they work, it's where their children go to school, it's where they have made connections, where they've made friends, the place where they live. and they don't have a voice in political decision making because they don't have the right to vote. As Sabir said, when we were in Scotland, we were lobbying really, really hard with the Scottish government to get them to a point whereby they would extend the franchise or extend voting rights to people who were still in the asylum system. That was a step too far for them at this stage, but I don't think that could never happen. Actually, in the Republic of Ireland at the moment, in local elections, people who are seeking asylum have got the right to vote. So there are moments of good stuff in the bleakness, and I think sometimes it's hard to see, but they're important to latch onto, because that's what gives you and other people a little bit of hope, right? A little bit of a boost to think that you're not just shouting into the void, you're not just kind of shouting with no outcome, I guess, and that, you know, with work that goes on for a long time, with dogged conversations with political decision makers, with conversations with your friends and family, with evidence, with all the right stuff behind you, you can achieve change. It just takes a long time, but it does happen.
That is very much amazing to hear, and I'm really glad that refugees can now vote and will have the right to vote in Scotland, and hopefully it's going to spread around. And as you were saying, it is very important that we focus on the good things that have happened as well, and it's a massive step towards integration and just making people feel welcome in the UK. I was just thinking on that point as well. Alex, I think you did a lot of research into the importance of having refugee-led organizations and being able to talk with communities that we with integration as well as just that. So if you just go a little bit into what you found out about like refugee-led organizations and why they're important.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we're to look for kind of positive silver linings of COVID-19, I think not just in the UK, but also around the world, where governments, international organizations, NGOs have often left gaps, where in the context of lockdown, there's been a need for service provision. It's often been refugees who have stepped into the gaps, that refugees through their own agency, through their own hard work, have provided sources of mutual aid and support to one another. And that gives a source of hope for how we can think about the contributions, the many contributions that refugees make to our societies. In our research, we've looked, particularly in the context I know best, which is East Africa, at refugee-led organizations in Kenya and Uganda. And before lockdown, there were literally hundreds of organizations in cities, in camps, founded by organizations doing amazing work in terms of providing social protection. So informal education, basic health services, social insurance, support for training, livelihoods, vocational training. And they were sort of locked out of the international humanitarian system in that they weren't really recognized by organizations like the UN Refugee Agency. They struggled to get funding from donors. Most funding went to the big NGOs or the UN agencies. And so they had to work below the radar. Now, what we've seen since COVID-19 is that with lockdown in big cities like Kampala and Nairobi, refugees were excluded from access to the food assistance provided by the government. And many NGOs and international organizations essentially packed up their work. And so stepping into the gap with these refugee-led organizations, providing food assistance, crowdfunding for it, sewing face masks. And I think that's led to a gradual change in recognizing on a global scale that refugee-led organizations are a big part of that response. Now, what does that mean here in the UK? Well, there's analogues to that. There's similarities. It's actually many asylum seekers, refugees, migrants as a whole that are frankly sustaining the British economy at a very difficult time. A lot of them, whether in the formal or the informal economy, are doing a lot of the work. They are the people doing the dangerous work in our care homes, in our hospitals, in markets, in hospitality, in construction. They make economic contributions, they make social contributions, they support one another on an informal level. So I think refugee-led organizations are just one part of trying to change the narrative about recognizing the contributions that refugees make to our societies, not just economic contributions, but social, cultural. And I don't think we make enough of that. We don't make enough in our political discussions, in our advocacy, to say refugees are people with obvious humanitarian needs. They have protection needs, but they're not just vulnerable people. They're diverse, as we've heard already. They are human beings in the most diverse possible sense of that. They are also contributors. They have skills, talents, and aspirations. And I think if we showcase those contributions, we can also assuage some of the often unfounded concerns or fears that the public has.
Sorry, Alex, just to go on from that, we have a question from the audience, and you're just talking about how if we talk about the contributions that people are making, then we can assuage those fears about people. So do stigmas in society against refugees and migrants drive all the effects that everybody on the panel has been discussing today, and how have these societal stigmas evolved?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I think in Britain and across most governments across Western Europe, there are kind of three bases for anti-asylum narrative. Now, this is a bit reductionist, but there's the kind of claim economically that they are a drain on scarce resources. There's the claim in terms of security that they're a threat through terrorism and other such things. And there's the identity-based claim that because they're different, they undermine the culture of a society. And we hear those narratives from kind of Viktor Orban's government in Hungary through to Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. We hear them on the far right of the spectrum, but we also hear them kind of seeping into the mainstream and seeping into kind of ordinary day-to-day politics. Now, I think it's a case of how can we challenge each of those? But also, a lot of the social science says that actually people are very supportive, surprisingly supportive of asylum seekers and refugees, but they're also particularly supportive if, first of all, they kind of have reasons for being here that are linked to persecution. And secondly, what comes out very strongly is if there's a sense that they make an economic contribution. So while I think we need to be careful with the economic contributors argument, because we have obligations to refugees, whether they can or can't contribute economically, I think the right to work is so important to welfare, as Lorna highlighted, but it's also something where we know from research that it tends to make a difference to public opinion. If people feel that refugees are contributors, they are more likely to be supportive. So I think we have to be careful about how we frame the narrative, to not say our support and protection of refugees is conditional upon their ability to contribute, but I think it can challenge some of those concerns and fears. And similarly, just on the threat to security, the basic empirical evidence really shows that there's no greater likelihood of asylum seekers and refugees being linked to terrorism than the average member of a population. I think just highlighting that is really important. And culturally, I think one positive thing we've seen this year with Black Lives Matter is a sense of real transformative change in thinking critically about race and racism in our society. So all of those narratives, I think we can shift.
Thank you. Sabir, is there anything that you'd like to add to that, maybe based on either your experience as well as now supporting people who are going through the asylum process, and what you have seen about societal stigmas and what that has been like?
Yeah, thanks, Taya. I think, yeah, it's important to highlight positive stories. People engage with positive contributions. I totally agree. I think we need to be mindful about just economic contribution, but I think that wider vibrancy and culture and richness that people bring and how that has enriched us over generation is also important. I think the other point that is really important in this work, and I've come across it, especially engaging with the public, is the fact that some members of the public would think we're doing something for the first time. I think reminding people that giving sanctuary protection is part of our identity, it's part of our values and principles. It's not something new we're embarking on. It's not, I think human beings are always mindful of the unknown and the uncertainty and the new. Something new is happening, a new culture is coming, or new people are coming. I think it's not new. The UK has welcomed people of a generation. I think approaching that conversation with that manner is really important. The other thing is that in this public engagement work is that there will always be 25% of the population who will totally stand with you and agree that we should give people protection, we should treat people with dignity and respect. There will be 25% who will totally disagree, and you cannot do much about it. But what is missing, I think what we need to engage with, is the middle anxious, the 50% who are not sure. I think that 50%, sadly, because of economic pressures, because of the pandemic and others, can grow and end up on the side of the 25%. So I think it's really, really important to engage with the people who might not totally agree with you, but are more understanding of the issues that people are facing. And I think that is a really important area of work for us in the sector, that we're not going to always have a big debate about this issue, but what we do is that we sell it or promote it as a human issue. These are people who are fleeing persecution, who might be fleeing poverty, but these are people who are also looking to rebuild their lives and make a contribution, whatever that contribution might be. They will be our neighbors, they will be our colleagues, they will be our friends and classmates and so on. I think there was a question in the chat around what I understand or the organization understands by the word integration. For me, having gone through the process of integration, but also the journey of asylum, I don't have an academic definition of integration. I think there are quite a lot of definitions there academically for the word integration. But for me, based on my own experience, but also the experiences of those that I now have the privilege to work with, integration happens when both the arriving person or the person seeking protection and the society giving protection fully discharge their responsibilities. And I think that is really important. So if I use my own example, I think I've done everything to integrate, and the society has given me everything to integrate as well. But still, there are some injustices. So for example, if I've got, let's say, an important event happening in my family, or my children have a significant birthday that they're coming to, my parents are not allowed to come from Afghanistan to visit them. So because of where I was born, my children who are British are not allowed the right to family life. So integration, sadly, mostly the burden of integration is on the person arriving. So you need to learn English language, well, that's important. You need to act like us, you need to learn our way of life and so on. But you do all of those, still there are certain rights that are not afforded to you. So I think it's important that integration is not just left on the person arriving. And I think that is the point, again, around the refugee right to vote as well. It is an important building block of integration. And the more those building blocks are missing, integration is a bit shaky, it's not strong. So if we have people living here, if we have people who are part of this society, if we have people here who are affected by the pandemic equally, then they need to be treated equally as well. So I think that's where I'm coming from, or we're coming from as an organization. Yeah, it's important to engage on positive stories, but it's also important to engage with pockets of society who may not always agree with us on those stories as well.
Definitely, thank you so much. You've spoken about integration as well as the importance of engaging with people who might not necessarily agree with what we think. I think one of the questions that has just been posed is about that. It's about is it a case of getting more young people to vote in elections to help the government take us more seriously, or is it a case of just being more persuasive towards other people who might not necessarily agree with us and our views that we have? Because I'm guessing a lot of people at this conference probably are on the same wavelength. And how do we have those conversations that are important to just in society with the 50% that Sabir mentioned? Lorna, could I start with you?
Yeah, big question, but I'll give it a go. I think there's never like a silver bullet with these kind of things. It's never like one thing that will fix it all, and there's like multiple different things that people can do across a spectrum of, effectively a spectrum of campaigning, I guess, which will all have a cumulative effect. I think particularly with students, I think, well, students, young people, lots of people, it can feel like you don't have that much power or that much of a voice. And I think sometimes it's about working out where your power lies, like where are your spheres of influence, who listens to you, who can you talk to, who can you persuade, and that will also have a ripple effect. You know, within a student union, there's all these different groups. Within your student friendship group, there's lots of people that are not here today with you in this style conference and maybe don't know as much as you do or have as much engagement with refugee issues, and there can be a bit of a chain reaction style thing whereby you can start small steps of changing the minds of the people around you, the people closest to you. Often folk talk about having conversations with people down the pub, and that's the kind of just as important to changing the narrative as those everyday conversations with people. On the flip side, I think when it comes to, there's obviously voting is incredibly important. I've just worked on a campaign around voting rights, of course I would say that, but voting isn't the only time where you can have an interaction or a dialogue with elected officials, be that in UK Parliament, be that in Holyrood, be that in the Senate, be that in your local authority. And what you see a lot, or what I see a lot with, particularly with MPs at the moment, is that they'll often reference the amount of correspondence they get from constituents about channel crossings, but maybe not from the perspective that we in this room would probably want it to come from. And I think you have to remember that other people who have differing views to you have a pretty vocal voice on this at the moment. So it's important that you are communicating a more positive vision to MPs as well, so they understand that there are people within their constituencies, people within, you know, if you're also a member of a political party, people within the political party that are proud to stand for the rights of refugees, can demonstrate and evidence an alternative narrative, and can promote a vision of society which welcomes people seeking sanctuary, as much as those who may be articulating the opposite. So I think I have a huge amount of faith in the power of like local connection and local conversations to make significant changes to the way that people think about and understand asylum. And I think going back to what Alex was saying in terms of those like thematic I guess stigmas around asylum and displaced people, they're abstract, right? They're easy to understand or easy to latch onto if you have no alternative information, be that no alternative conversation with somebody close to you, you've never met somebody who's gone through the asylum process. Those abstract ideas can like really take root. So those local conversations, those one-on-one dialogues, if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I'd be telling everyone to get off the internet and have normal chats. Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the whole thing.
That's very true. I always find it hard to have daily conversations with people that are just really close to me, because I guess it's one of those things that's just slightly harder to do because you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of it with people that you're really close to. But I guess we have to challenge that. And I think one of the issues that we're possibly going to cover today was about Brexit and how that showed some deep societal divides and how people viewed the question of immigration. But we have a question from the audience to Alex. To what extent will Brexit have an impact on asylum seekers and refugees?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I just wanted to add something to what Lorna said. I think it's really important to try to be empathetic towards people who have different views. So we live in an era of kind of echo chambers, filter bubbles. We like to talk to people who agree with us. We often like to virtue signal amongst like-minded people. It's very easy to exacerbate polarization and assume the people with other views are wrong. And I think Lorna's exactly right about the role that contact plays, that actually a lot of the time people who have anti-immigration attitudes or anti-asylum attitudes are the people least likely to actually interact with asylum seekers or migrants. We see that geographically, that the regions that are most positive towards immigration and asylum are the regions with the highest levels of immigration. The regions that are most skeptical and most likely to vote for anti-immigration parties are often those with the lowest levels of integration. But those areas, and this applies to the United States, it applies to the UK, it applies to Germany, where you see the highest levels of anti-immigration sentiment, are often those that have had real structural damage done to their economies. Areas where there used to be labor-intensive manufacturing jobs that have disappeared. And often it's elite politicians that scapegoat migrants to appeal to the vote in those areas. So how is it that the Conservative government has got such an increase in its vote share in the north of England? It's by appealing to predominantly white working class people. But many of those populations face other really genuine structural challenges in their lives. It's just those structural challenges have been narrated as problems of immigration. So I think actually having a degree of empathy for why it is people believe what they believe, even if it's not our starting point, can actually help us make progress and build bridges. In terms of Brexit, there are massive structural challenges. Part of it is around the narrative, which I think is increasingly becoming borderline nationalistic. And I think I see the kind of emergence of a kind of English patriotism verging on nationalism, emerging in politics, emerging in society. I have real fears for where Scotland will sit in the next few years, and hearing from two extremely articulate people based in Scotland. I don't want the rest of the United Kingdom to lose Scotland. But it's a real fear for what that will mean in terms of the narrative around asylum and refugees and the politics and how decisions are made. But also one thing we haven't talked about is law. And at the moment, one of the constraints on majoritarian politics is the legal framework, which is bound up with European community law. And when we start eroding those ties to the European community, we undermine our common European asylum system. And the common European asylum system has many, many flaws in it, but it also reinforces some of the norms around international refugee law and incorporates them in English law, for instance. And when we erode that, we're having to build new paths. So law is a very important, for all its flaws, for all its limitations in influencing politics, law serves a key role as a bulwark, as a line that allows strategic litigation, allows the judiciary to overcome the most majoritarian, challenging nativist instincts in politics. And so I think that's one of the big worries. The flip side, if we try to look for positives, hard though it is with Brexit, is we have a chance to reinvent what it means to be the United Kingdom in the wider world. What kind of Britain do we want to be? And I think Sabir very articulately sort of said, well, actually there's a history. Britain's role in providing sanctuary to Jews fleeing the Holocaust, Britain's role towards Ugandan Asians fleeing Idi Amin in the 1970s, Britain's role with Kosovar refugees in the 1990s. These show the way we can appropriate patriotic narratives and say, Britain's identity is one of playing an active role in protecting refugees in the world. That's the Britain we want. And let's form bilateral relationships that respect that. So with Greece, for instance, why shouldn't we as Britain provide resettlement and relocation to refugees on the Greek islands and do it unilaterally and take credit for that and be proud of that contribution? Why shouldn't Britain build its own British refugee policy? We've never talked about a British refugee policy. We talk about asylum and immigration policy, and that's a Home Office thing. Then traditionally, DFID has done the humanitarian and development thing overseas, but we've never had a narrative of what is a British refugee policy. And that's an area where I'm trying to start a new project to ask, well, what should the characteristics of a British refugee policy be post-Brexit? What's a British refugee policy that we can be proud of that joins up asylum and immigration, integration, overseas development aid, humanitarianism, resettlement policies, and yet we haven't had that conversation politically. So there's no playbook that politicians and the public can gather around and say, as British people, we're proud of our historical reputation in this area and we want to take this forwards.
That was a lot to unpack, but it all sounds incredibly interesting. And I guess the part that I'm going to go from that is kind of to a final question. So one thing are you looking forward to in 2021? I'm not sure, Sabir, you had something to add to that.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think it's a very challenging context, and trying to be a little bit more hopeful about the future will always be difficult for all of us. But having gone or having lived through conflict, I do believe in good days waiting ahead. So to me, the hope doesn't come from anything tangible that will come our way next year, but it comes from the journey that we're on, the challenges and the difficulties. And I always find conflict and challenges, and even the pandemic might not be similar to what myself and most refugees fleeing conflict lived through, but whether economic challenges or armed conflicts, these are things that can be very innovative as well. It could lead to some new ways of doing things, but to me, the hope comes from that process of reckoning, reimagining, and renewing our society after the pandemic, Brexit, and the economic challenges, and what role we can all play in that, no matter where we come from, no matter what status we have. And I think, although I'm not too sure about the government initiatives of Global Britain, Cause for Good, and others, but again, we can use those to look at, define our role in that global context as well. Okay, if you really want to be global and cause for good, then that cannot go with borders, or it cannot go with the way we treat our new citizens. I think there is also hope following Brexit, that opportunities that will be provided through constitutional changes potentially as well, and how we can use the debate probably in Scotland, if there is a second independence referendum, how that can be used to advocate for better rights for refugees across the UK. I think that's something that I also feel that next year with Scottish elections and others, there will be an opportunity to see if we could, if some of the constitutional debates will be used to advocate for better rights and more progressive policies on asylum and integration across the UK. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabir and Alex. You've both talked about just having the opportunity to rework and reframe how we're looking at immigration and asylum policies. Lorna, do you have a similar view, or is there something else you're looking forward to in 2021?
I think I have a relatively similar view. I think I also have the deep-rooted sense of caution about how much power we have to influence where the government is now. But of course, with every, what do they say, with every crisis comes an opportunity, and it's important to to at least engage with it and see if we can turn something into something else which is more productive and positive for people seeking asylum. I think the point that Sabir has just made about upcoming elections in 2021, obviously you've got Holyrood elections, you've got Senate elections, you've also got local government elections across a lot of England, fingers crossed with the pandemic, and also elections for combined authority metro mayors. So for you in Greater Manchester, people like Andy Burnham up in Liverpool, Steve Rotherham, there's an important moment, right, kind of post-pandemic, about what kind of world we want to, well, what kind of country we want to live in and what matters to all of us. And I think ongoing constitutional conversations, which don't just apply to Scotland and to Wales, but also to England, like how does power lie across the whole of England and north of England, those are going to be really pertinent questions for next year, and it'll be important to have conversations about refugee and migrants' rights within that, right? Because people seeking asylum, people who have migrated to the UK, are local citizens just like the rest of us, eh? So they should have a voice, even if they don't quite yet have the right to vote in England. In terms of what I'm hopeful for in 2021, I think I'm a bit more scared than I am hopeful, unfortunately. However, I do hope that we learn from the pandemic. I hope that we learn and remember how connected we all are across the UK, but also globally, and how by luck, by fate, by accident, however you want to put it, your life can change overnight and become something that you never imagined and never would recognise. And I hope that makes us all a bit more compassionate and a bit more empathetic and considerate. I hope it also means that we no longer accept that there is no alternative. COVID has forced government spending, it's forced policy change, it's forced rapid reconfiguring of the way that we live our lives, in a way that, you know, in January no one would ever have said was possible. And I think we just need to hold on to that and, yeah, never ever accept again that there isn't an alternative. There's always the possibility to change stuff.
That is definitely very true. The government has stepped up when we've demanded that they step up during this year. So there's definitely something hopeful to look forward there. I know we don't have long, but Alex, did you have anything that you wanted to add about what you're hopeful for?
I think Lorna's put it really well. We face massive challenges. I don't think it can be underplayed how significant the global recession is going to be, both in terms of increasing needs and numbers of displaced people around the world, but also threatening solidarity and undermining the welfare of many communities in our own countries, with the real risk that they then lurch towards extremist politics. I think, like Lorna, I sort of have that element of caution, but I think I agree very much that it shows that everything is up for grabs, that there are so many things we're going to have to reinvent in our society across the board. And I think it's absolutely right to say the myth that we're stuck with the status quo has well and truly gone. Things can change very rapidly. The government can spend huge amounts of money if there's political will. It can be responsive. People can change things. So I think we're faced with very significant challenges and constraints, but we should also recognise, very much as Lorna said really articulately, that we can make a difference. We've just got to make the opportunity to be engaged, demanding, articulate, but also remember that polarization is, I think, the enemy of success, and we need to be empathetic and tolerant of people we may disagree with, and try to build as many bridges as we can.
Thank you so much to all our panelists, to Alex, to Sabir, and to Lorna. I think, as Alex finished with, the idea of polarization and just reaching out and making sure that we build bridges and talk to people who don't necessarily feel the same way that we do. I think it's very important that we all do that, especially as we're continuously having these conversations amongst ourselves. And it was really great to have these conversations with you. And I hope everybody got something that they can take forward into 2021 from today. And thank you so much for sharing all the work that you do and everything that you've been doing to help the communities that we are all a part of. And I'm going to hand over to Emily now.